Our speaker tonight, James Bamford, not only wrote the first major book about the NSA in 1982, he actually discovered the NSA publicly because they were so secret. In fact, I believe at one point even their car park was a secret, correct? Even their Christmas cards. But his first book, The Puzzle Palace, a report on America's most secret agency, was a bestseller. He then has gone on to write two more major books on the NSA, Body of Secrets in 2002, and The Shadow Factory, the ultra-secret NSA from 9/11 to the eavesdropping on America in 2008. He was an intelligence analyst for the US Navy for 3 years during the Vietnam War. Spent a large part of that in Hawaii, also, as he will tell you, where Mr. Snowden also spent some time. Then he got a law degree from Suffolk University Law School in Boston before becoming a writer. He's also taught at UC Berkeley. And in the summer of 2014, oh, we got some bears over there. And in the summer of 2014, he conducted the lengthiest in-person interview of Eric Snowden. I think for 3 days, he hung out with Eric Snowden in Moscow. So, Jim, I'd like to start. Can you just give us a sense of the magnitude and the capabilities of the NSA? Their staff numbers are secret, some 30, 40,000, who knows, a budget of 10 billion, north of 10 billion. Give us a sense of how big they are and what they can do, please.
Sure, Terry, it's great being here. I really enjoy your inviting me here. And is this not working? Can you hear me now? Yeah, again, thank you for having me here. And I come here from Washington, where it was 20 degrees. So as long as you want to keep me here, next 2 or 3 months would be very fine. In terms of the size of NSA, NSA is the largest intelligence agency on Earth. It's got about 30,000, 35,000 employees that work in the U.S. area, and then they've got more employees that work around the country. And what they're doing now, it hasn't gotten much publicity, but NSA is becoming much larger because there's a new agency that's being attached to it. It's called U.S. Cyber Command. And the director of NSA will be in charge of both NSA and Cyber Command. So he'll be the most powerful intelligence official in the history of the world. He'll control both the largest intelligence agency on Earth, the NSA, and he'll control a new agency that will be able to launch wars, cyber wars, secretly. So that's why now the head of NSA wears 4 stars. It used to be 3. But now he's the most powerful intelligence official in the world. And the NSA itself has enormous power around the world in terms of eavesdropping, in terms of planting malware in computers around the world. There's one slide that came out from Snowden, for example, that showed that it actually had a map of the world, and it showed yellow dots. And the yellow dots were where NSA had planted malware. That means bad things in your computer. And it showed 50,000 locations around the world. And then there was another slide that came from NSA, and it showed that they were working on finding 1 million locations around the world to plant it. So NSA has enormous amounts of power because today, if you control information, you control power.
And the amount of money they spend?
Well, the total budget's about $50 billion for the intelligence community, and the NSA gets about $10.5 billion. CIA gets about $14 billion. The NSA used to get a lot more money than the CIA. The CIA always used to get less money than the NSA, but now with all the drones that the CIA is buying, CIA has a bigger budget.
Now, on top of their staffers, there's an enormous number of contractors,
right,
which are not included in this figure.
No, the contractors are besides the actual personnel figures. And before 9/11, NSA never really contracted out. They did everything in-house. But then after 9/11, there was so much money going into NSA. They didn't have enough room or enough personnel to do everything themselves. So they began outsourcing to companies, a lot of big companies like Lockheed and Booz Allen and companies like that, SAIC, And then lots of little companies that nobody's ever heard of, 3 or 4, 5-member companies. A lot of them were companies formed by people that left NSA. So now you have probably at least a third, if not more, of the NSA's work is being done not by NSA itself, but by contractors. And one of the problems with that is that it's very difficult to account for how much of this money is going where. In addition, with the NSA, you can send a Freedom of Information Act request to find out what they're doing, although it's never usually very successful. You can't do that with a private corporation. Private corporations aren't called into Congress to ask questions. So there's a lack of accountability when it comes to private corporations, and that's why I think a lot of people are trying to get the intelligence community to reduce the number of contractors.
Now, their deputy director, John Inglis, a couple of years ago, I think he said that the NSA was the world's largest employer of introverts. You've met NSA employees. Give us a sense of what type of people they hire and what their skill sets are.
Matter of fact, I was just with the deputy director, Chris Inglis, just last week, giving a talk. But that was true. That was actually a survey that was done that sort of surveyed the different agencies, and NSA did come out to be largely introverts. And the reason for that is, and it's largely true, the reason for it is because of the secrecy that goes into NSA, the types of people they hire, and the location. Excuse me. For one thing, the agency is located halfway between Washington and Baltimore. It's kind of in the, it's not in the middle of nowhere, but it's not in downtown Washington, or where the CIA, for example, is very close to Washington, a lot of the other intelligence agencies. So it's a much more cosmopolitan group. The NSA, however, lives in this little world between NSA, between Washington and Baltimore. And in interviewing lots of people, a lot of them are very afraid of getting involved with parties, with friends, and going to barbecues and so forth, with people who are not in the little NSA community, or actually the big NSA community, because they're very afraid a lot of times of saying something by accident. Well, you might be going to a barbecue this weekend and talk about the Middle East or what's happening with ISIS or whatever, and people are talking about the latest developments, and then he might contribute something, and the person that works for NSA, I've heard from many people, would be afraid that they're going to say something that they learned from a document or they learned from an intercept that they read. So they tend to try to avoid socializing a lot of times with outsiders, just for the fear that they're going to actually say something that they learned in secret and forgot that they read it in a secret document as opposed to a newspaper. And all that sort of tends to keep people sort of insular and creates that sort of feeling of looking down at your shoes and not being a extrovert.
Now, in addition to Fort Meade, they have a major facility in Utah, which is going to be their big storage facility. And then they have this supercomputer research project in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Can you give us a sense of the volume of data that they're now processing? You see these figures, terabytes and petabytes. I mean, kind of your mind boggles. But can you give us a sense of the volume of data there?
Yeah, it's very, very difficult to give a real sense of data because it's these terms that they use are so abstract. It's hard to even imagine. For example, this data center they just finished building in Utah is the largest data center on Earth. It'll be it is 1 million square feet, and it's been estimated that they can maybe hold a yottabyte worth of data. A yottabyte is the highest number that's ever been created in terms of measuring data. There is no number beyond yotta. So it's going to hold the largest amount of material that's ever been created in terms of numbers, because it gets all this material from the intercepts that it picks up from satellites, from listening posts, and all your metadata. Every time you pick up a phone, a cell phone or any phone, and make a call, a record of that is going to Bluffdale, Utah. And it used to be, up until a couple of years ago, every time you hit a send button on your computer, all that metadata would go to NSA. So it collects enormous amounts and has to have a place to store it. And that's why they have this facility, and they measure it in, like I said, a yottabyte, which is somewhere, somebody mentioned it was something like, if you build a stack of paper and kept building it, it would go to the moon and back about 10 times, something like that. Then the other thing is, how do you go through all that paper? How do you go through all that data? And it's very, very difficult. One way that they've come up is to build a brand new computer that will be the largest computer ever created and the fastest computer ever created. And they're building it down in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where they did the Manhattan Project, which was the project to build the atomic bomb in World War II. And now they've got a new Manhattan Project. It's to build the world's biggest computer. And the speed that they're going to measure this computer at will be 1 billion operations a second. So they need that kind of speed to go through all that data. But in order to get a computer that is that powerful, it will take up an entire warehouse. And then in order to cool it, you know, if you have your laptop, put it on your lap, it starts getting warm. Well, big computers get much warmer than that. So you need a lot of water to cool them. And the estimate for the amount of water to cool this computer that they're building will be about the same amount of cooling power that was needed to cool both towers of the World Trade Center. So, and once they get that computer built, then they're going to work on another one that's going to be even faster. So 1 billion operations a second. That's every time you blink your eye, 1 billion. They can go through 1 billion pieces of information.
Now, I want to ask you about Snowden, but let me first ask you about your experience. You started out, your primary interest or initial interest in the NSA was as a whistleblower. Explain to us how that came about and what then got you into your expertise for the rest of your life on the NSA.
Yeah, well, during the Vietnam War, you know, they had the draft, and I got very worried about getting drafted. I had no real desire at all to go to Vietnam, so I chose sort of an easy way. I joined the Navy, and I joined this unit in the Navy where they fill your brain with too many secrets, and they would never send you to Vietnam. It was an NSA unit, and they sent me to this NSA place in Hawaii. Happened to be almost the same place that Snowden was at. So I spent 3 years in the Navy. And I was lucky I did, because when they did have the draft, it was the only thing I ever won in my life. I got number 1. When on the very first time they did the draft, they pulled out the birthday, and it was September 14th, which was my birthday. So I was glad I had gone in. Anyway, so I did 3 years in the Navy, and then I went to law school, and I was still in the Navy Reserve. So then every once a year, I'd have to go someplace for 2 weeks for active duty. And they were actually very nice. Since I was in law school, they said you can go wherever you want, whenever you want. So I said, well, how about during the fall vacation? And how about someplace warm, you know, like maybe Puerto Rico or someplace? And they said, okay. And then there was a NSA listening post there in Puerto Rico, a place called Sabana Seca. So they sent me down there for 2 weeks, and I'd seen listening posts before. It wasn't anything that was really new to me. And this one was a listening post that was focused on eavesdropping on South America and Central America and Cuba and that that area. But I didn't speak really. I had a couple years of Spanish. I didn't really speak it very fluently, so I was just pretty much trying to avoid work in the listening post, doing my 2 weeks, and then trying to get out every day to go swimming at the beach. But then one day, one of the people that I went out for a beer with the night before said, hey, come on over, you want to listen to something? And I said, well, I don't speak Spanish, so it's not going to do me much good. And he says, no, it's English. So I put the earphones on, and they were Americans talking to each other. And I thought that was very weird, because I was in law school. I was in my last year, and I was a voluntary prosecutor. So I was working in the courthouse in Boston and part-time. And we had a lot of discussions about if you want to, get a search warrant, if you want to eavesdrop, all the procedures you have to go through. And here was the NSA eavesdropping on Americans, and nobody knew about it. Well, at that very time, the church committee, Senator Frank Church, had this committee going, investigating abuses in the intelligence community. And so it was making a lot of headlines. They were doing a lot of investigations, and I called him up out of the blue. I just decided to become a whistleblower and say and tell them that NSA was eavesdropping on Americans down in from their listening post in Puerto Rico. Well, I spoke to the committee, and it was a call out of the blue. I think they thought I was sort of a crank until I told them actually where I was a couple weeks earlier at Savannah Seca. And then they took me seriously, and they said that NSA had told them that they stopped that a year and a half earlier. And I said, well, I was just down there last month or a couple weeks ago, and they're still doing it. So they sent some people down there and on a surprise inspection, found out I was telling the truth, and they had me testify under oath in the committee. So I was ready to get out of law school. I didn't really have my heart into practicing law. I really wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know how to, how do you become a writer? So I was thinking, I've got to find a topic to write about, and NSA, nobody had ever done a book on NSA. I thought, well, here's an agency that's hugely secret, that's been violating the law, that nobody knows anything about, and so I decided I'd write the first book on NSA, and it was quite an experience. The NSA threatened me twice with prosecution under the espionage statute because in doing my research, I sent an FOI request, Freedom of Information request, to the Justice Department for what I had heard a rumor about was a criminal investigation of NSA. I mean, the first time the criminal division had ever investigated an entire agency. And lo and behold, there was a criminal investigation, and the NSA was looked at as basically a criminal entity. They actually read the Miranda rights to senior officials at the agency. I mean, it is unheard of. And they came up with a report that pointed to about 20 different areas of possible prosecution. But then they decided that there'd be too many secrets that would come out in court, so they decided to just put the report in a drawer and lock it away. Well, I got that report under this Freedom of Information Act request. And NSA didn't know I had gotten it, and then when they found out that I had gotten that report, they reclassified it as top secret and demanded I give it back. So I politely said I'm not giving it back. It was given to me by previous administration, and so they threatened me several times with prosecution, and eventually I never gave the document back, and we found there was this law that said, or this executive order that said, once a document's been declassified, it can't be reclassified. So we were basing our denial of returning the document on that. But then President Reagan went up to President Reagan in the White House, and President Reagan changed the executive order to say once a document's been declassified, it can be reclassified. But my favorite legal phrase is ex post facto. In other words, I can't prosecute somebody who did the act before it became a crime. So I was scot-free on that.
Now, fast forward 3 books on the NSA later. Edward Snowden starts releasing these NSA documents, and you want to get an interview, but he's in Moscow, and no one knows where he is exactly. How did you get that interview, and what was it like meeting him?
Well, it took a lot of time. It took a lot of work to get the interview because everybody in the world was trying to get an interview with him. So I was very determined. I flew down to Rio twice to meet Glenn Greenwald, who was one of the people who got the documents. I flew to Berlin and met with Laura Poitras, who I'd known for years before she ever even got involved with Snowden, and I spent a lot of time with Snowden's attorney in New York. It turned out, the fact that I was in Hawaii, like Snowden, working for the NSA, that I became a much more minor whistleblower, like he is, much bigger whistleblower, and the fact that I wrote all these books on NSA and numerous articles and a documentary for PBS, and so I'm the world's expert on NSA. So you put all these things together, and I was writing a cover story for Wired magazine. So I was the one. I guess he decided to tell his story. He was going to tell his story in two big releases. One was going to be on television, which he gave to NBC, and the other was in a print article, which is the article I did for Wired. So it was really fascinating. Once the approvals and everything came through, and he agreed to talk to me, then I had to fly to Moscow, and all the communication had to be encrypted. You had to do a lot of efforts to keep that information very secret. So I flew to Moscow, and when I got there, I still hadn't gotten the final piece of communication telling me when and where I was supposed to meet him. So I hung around for a couple of days waiting for that, and finally there was a message that came in, an encrypted message on my computer. And when I left the United States, Wired had given me a clean computer, one that had never been used before. So I didn't have any information on there, except for this one encryption program. And so I was told to go to a certain location, and I had to sit in a particular area. I had to have a book that I was reading. And so I did all that, and I sort of took a few precautionary roundabout ways of getting where I was supposed to go in case anybody was following me. And then when I was sitting there, he was supposed to come up to me, but I was sitting there, and I guess I was facing the wrong way because he came into this place from the back, and so he missed me, and I saw him walk past me. So then I got up and walked next to him. I said, "Hi, Ed. You missed me. I was sitting there." And he says, "Oh, I didn't see you." And I said, "Well, weren't you supposed to have been in the CIA?" And he got a big kick out of that and laughed, and it was good for breaking the ice. And then we went someplace to talk. I spent 3 days hanging out with him, so we had pizza and had lots of time to chat. And he came to my hotel room a couple times, and I went to see him. So after 3 days, it became a much more informal relationship in dealing with him, and I thought that was really interesting, sort of getting insight from this person who was probably the most wanted person on earth at that moment. And he was very calm. He was actually very happy at that point because his girlfriend had come over. I wasn't allowed to report that in the article. His girlfriend didn't want me to report it, but his girlfriend was living with him there in Moscow, and he seemed to be doing pretty well. I wrote in the article that he's sort of like the ultimate grad student. I mean, I was a grad student, and I lived on ramen noodles, and I had a black and white television set back in those days, and I didn't have a lot of luxuries, and I didn't really care. And that's sort of the way he is. He doesn't need a fancy car. He doesn't need a lot of earthly luxuries. He's kind of happy where he is. As long as he has his computer and he can connect to the internet and he's got his girlfriend with him, he's happy. So I think that's where he's going to be for quite some time.
So Edward Snowden is an extremely controversial figure in this country, as you know. There are many people that regard him as a traitor, up as far as Bill Gates, who said this guy's no hero, he's done tremendous damage to the United States. There are other people who think he's performed tremendous service to the United States. So where do you come down? Is he a hero or is he a traitor?
Well, I hate those black or white choices. I've always called him a heroic or a courageous whistleblower, and that's what he is. So he blew the whistle without any really any thought of himself. He was keeping his fingers crossed that he'd be able to get asylum in Hong Kong. That didn't work out, and he had to go to Moscow. the government cut his passport off halfway to Moscow. So when he got there, he didn't have a travel document, and he was stuck there for 3 months. So for 40 days. So the Russians eventually gave him asylum. So he didn't pick to go to Moscow. He was there by default because the U.S. had cut off his passport on the way to Ecuador. So he's sort of making the best of his situation. I think he, again, I give him a lot of credit for being very, very courageous. He was making $120,000 a year. He was living in Hawaii. His girlfriend was a pole dancer. I don't have to explain what a pole dancer is, I guess, but it has nothing to do with Poland. So anyway, he was very happy there, but he was seeing a lot of things that were going on that he didn't like. And as a result of that, he became a whistleblower. Just to give you a little background, the hardest part I had with Snowden, it became very tense my first half day with him, because I didn't want to just go back and report what everybody else reported. I had Wired was paying a lot of money for this, and they wanted something new. The new thing was, who is Edward Snowden? So I wanted him to tell me who he was growing up, how he got to be who he was, what he wrote, what kind of books he read when he was a kid, all those kind of personal things. And he didn't want to talk about that at all. He just, and I almost got to the point where I was almost going to threaten to leave and fly back. But then he eventually did tell me that. And I did get that information about how he began and everything, which really sort of completed the article on how who he is and how he got to where he was. And that's sort of key. When he was, he comes from a military family. His father spent 30 years in the Coast Guard. His mother worked for the federal court system, and his sister's a lawyer in the federal court system. And he went into the after 9/11. He went into the Army, the Special Forces, and to go fight in Iraq. And it turns out he's a very small guy, very thin and very frail, actually. So in doing all this, marching and running and backpacks, he shattered both his legs. So that gave him medical discharge out of the Army. You need 2 good legs, especially if you're going to be special forces. So he got out, but he still wanted to do something. And then he was very good at computers, and both the NSA and the CIA, they don't really care if you have a PhD from Harvard in computer science. That's very nice, but if you could do enormous hacking that doesn't require a PhD, it just requires a good amount of knowledge of how computers work and how to break into computers, you get hired, and that was his capability. He had this enormous capability to hack computers, to do lots of things with computers. So he got hired by the CIA. He spent a number of years there. And while he was there, he saw that the U.S. was involved in all these drone attacks, that we were spying on our own citizens and so forth. So all that drove him to be a whistleblower.
Now, I'd like to drill down a little bit more into this. In your story about him, you write that he was initially shocked at discovering the level of surveillance of U.S. citizens. And that was what seemed to prompt him to become a whistleblower. But he started mining information for quite a while. He then deliberately got a job with Booz Allen so that he could get into another area of NSA operations, which were their offensive cyber warfare capabilities, which are against other countries. And he got particularly exposed, I think, to what we're doing in China. And I think that some of the critics of Snowden would say, okay, we understand that there are concerns about the privacy of American citizens. But when you started talking about our activities overseas, that's where you crossed the line and you were essentially betraying the United States. Is there any validity in that there was a point where he actually went too far and revealed stuff that he shouldn't have?
Well, you have to understand, just to take that from the beginning, yes, he did joined Booz Allen because he'd learned a lot about the NSA when he was working for Dell Computer. You know, it's interesting. He never worked for NSA. This is the way it works for a lot of contractors. They don't actually work for the agency. They work for a contractor. So he never worked for NSA. He worked for a contractor. And he wanted, but he had access to all the NSA information. And then he wanted to find out about cyber warfare. So that was his last job, going to Booz Allen, where he became a cyber warfare expert. And that's interesting because I also interviewed Snowden in Moscow for a PBS program I'm doing on cyber warfare. So I had an hour interview on camera, and that's actually, well, the program's coming out later this year, but you can actually read the 25-page transcript of my interview with him on the PBS Nova website, as well as a video clip. But that was it. He began learning a lot about cyber warfare, the fact that the U.S. is launching enormous amounts of offensive cyber warfare, planning malware countries around the world. That was also a contributing factor. The two most important factors in the end, however, was seeing James Clapper, who is the Director of National Intelligence, go before a Senate committee and actually lie about the fact that NSA is eavesdropping on American citizens. That was one of the two straws that broke the camel's back. And the other one was, he told me in Moscow, was the the fact that the director, General Alexander, lied before Congress. And that was a lie based on something that I had done, which was that I wrote an article for Wired on Bluffdale, that big data center. And in that article, I interviewed a number of whistleblowers, including a person named Bill Benny, who had been at NSA for almost 40 years. A very senior official. He did created all the automating of NSA's eavesdropping all over the world. But then he quit when he found that NSA was turning all that on U.S. citizens, on the American public. He quit. Anyway, he became a whistleblower to me. He told me all about eavesdropping, the NSA's eavesdropping in the U.S. And I put it in the magazine, and he allowed me to put his name to it. But then there was a congressional hearing, and the director of NSA was asked about my article and all these charges that were made in it by Bill Benny and so forth. And the director lied. He kept saying, no, we don't do this, we don't do this, we don't do this. And again, that was one of the things that Snowden saw, and that was what Snowden said convinced him he had to take all the documents. When I interviewed Bill Benny, he just told me these things. So they go in my article, and the director could come out and deny him. And if you're the Washington Post, who are you going to believe? Somebody you never heard of, an employee, or this guy with 4 stars on his shoulder, the general in charge. So Snowden thought, well, the only way, if I'm going to blow the whistle, I'm not going to be able to blow the whistle and then it's not going to do me any good to blow the whistle and then have the director come out and just deny everything. So I'm going to have to take the documents. And the government now says there are 1.7 million documents, I think, which is a much larger number than there really is. So the other part of your question was
well, when he went from just domestic operations to revealing operations in China.
Yeah, that now he didn't. You have to understand that he's not actually revealing anything. He gave all these flash drives with all the data on it to 2 journalists, basically, to Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras. The idea here being that he was going to let them decide, and other journalists too. I've actually one of the few that's actually had unlimited access to Snowden's documents. But let them decide what is going to go out into the public domain and not him. So after he left Hong Kong, he had no more to do with the documents at all. He still doesn't. So it's Glenn Greenwald, Laura Poitras, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the New York Times, whoever gets access, who's ever given access to the documents, makes those decisions. Now, as far as I know, there haven't been any documents released dealing with our spying in China or whatever. I think there was some leak that came from Glenn Greenwald recently about our planning malware in China or whatever. But there hasn't been any great bulk of release of information on our adversaries or foreign countries. It's all been pretty much domestically oriented. And if you want to blame somebody, you've got to blame the people who put the articles out, and that's not Snowden. It's either the Washington Post or the
right, but they wouldn't be able to put out these articles unless he'd leaked this classified information. But tell me, what is the end game here? He's in Moscow. Mm-hmm. He just got his visa extended for 3 years. He's an American.
Yeah.
I think he said a number of times he'd like to come back. How does this play out now? The government wants him to come and talk to the Justice Department, probably for a long period of time. How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I don't think they'd use the word talk. Confess is actually, I think, the word that they would use. But yeah, they've got a lot of heavy charges against him. I interviewed him when I interviewed him in Moscow. I brought that up to him, and he did say he would be willing to come back, but he'd have to come back under a plea agreement. He's willing to go to jail. How long? It depends on the plea agreement. A year or 2 years. Who's to say? The government hasn't made any effort whatsoever to try to work out some kind of a plea agreement. I mean, the government works out plea agreements with, mafia hitmen all the time. This is not a new idea to actually work out a plea agreement. If you're the government, they do it all the time. Every murder case is usually some kind of a plea agreement at some point. Working out a plea agreement would not be that original with Snowden. However, they haven't tried it yet. One possibility that they should try, I think, is they could work out an agreement where Snowden uses his good offices, for lack of a better term, to try to convince a couple of the custodians of the documents, who are the journalists, to allow NSA to get access to the documents to see them, not to take them away, but just to see them, to catalog them, all these documents, because that's really what NSA needs to know. NSA needs to know, 3 weeks from now, a document's going to come out. They don't know a document's going to come out because they don't know what documents are missing. If they knew what documents are missing, then they would be able to plan ways to counter the damage that might come out. So that's an area where they could actually work out an agreement with Snowden, but they haven't tried that yet, and I think it would be fruitful.
Now, I want to open up to questions, but let me just ask one more. I presume that part of the government's reticence is the fear that this will spark more whistleblowers, and as your own reporting has shown, there is already a second guy out there, guy or girl, who is releasing anonymously information sort of under Snowden's umbrella. It's not clear, but there does seem to be more information coming out that doesn't come from Snowden. I guess they're scared there'll be a torrent.
Right, yeah, this is a very sensitive topic. It's a sensitive topic even within the circle of people I deal with, because this is a circle that deals with whistleblowers. So when you're talking about whistleblowers, it's very sensitive. But what happened is that when I was in Moscow, Snowden said that he was a bit angry because there are documents that are coming out that are being attributed to him that he had nothing to do with. And I actually, because I got access to documents, I was actually able to look through some of these, do a search through the documents for some of the new documents that were coming out, and they weren't in his archive. There's one particular document that came out that was rather extraordinary. It was it's called the ANT catalog, A-N-T. A-N-T stands for something like Advanced Network Techniques or something like that. And what it is basically a catalog of how NSA does all its eavesdropping all over the place. What kind of equipment it uses, how that equipment works. It's somewhat technical, but it's very highly classified, and it's a whole catalog of techniques. And Snowden said, that wasn't me, I didn't do that. And I went through his documents. The ANT catalog is not in his documents. So whoever had access to it and then leaked it, it was published, I think, first in Der Spiegel, the German magazine. has access to a lot of very highly classified information. And again, nobody knows who this is or where this information is coming from or whether the person is still there or not.
Okay, let's get some questions from the floor. We have a microphone here. If you put your hand up, Alexander will get to you.
Thank you. Thank you. You've given us a wonderful description of how we're allowed to know, let's put it that way, what the NSA is doing. However, to analyze it, how effective do you think it is? Because we are giving up some of our liberties, if not lots of our liberties for this. And is it worth it in the end of the net result if you were to analyze it? That's really what I think the crux of the problem comes down to.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and that's it's an issue that really needs to be analyzed because people aren't. The problem is during the Cold War, NSA was able to do a very good job on watching the Soviet Union because the Soviet Army and the Soviet Navy and the Soviet Air Force all communicated on particular frequencies. So if you just target those frequencies, you're able to pick everything up. After the Cold War, after Russia became Soviet Union became Russia, and we became somewhat friends with Russia, NSA didn't have quite a mission, so they decided to become the counter-terrorist organization. And the problem is NSA isn't designed to do counterterrorism work. The Russians, like I said, communicate most militaries communicate on certain frequencies. Terrorists communicate on everything. They communicate on cell phones, on everybody's same network. So in order to catch them, you've got to collect all the information. And that's just, you build this enormous haystack of data, and then it makes it so much more difficult to try to find it because you're collecting everything. That was actually what the director of NSA said when he, after 9/11, that would be the policy. We collect everything. And that's the whole idea, to collect everything and then search through it. The problem is, if you look at their plus and minus list, the minus is much bigger than the plus. So they missed the First World Trade Center bombing. They missed the attack on the coal. They missed the attacks on the U.S. embassies in East Africa. They missed 9/11. They missed the underwear bomber and so forth, all these Boston bombing. And the problem is that they've got too much information to search through, and they keep missing it. So you have to wonder if that's a good way to do this, to collect everything or to find ways to narrow it down. The Boston bombers, for example, where there was the Russians had warned the United States about them. The NSA had far more information on the hijackers than before the attack took place. I don't have enough time to go into it, but I did a documentary for PBS on how NSA blew 9/11, and I did a book called The Shadow Factory that went into it. But the point was that the NSA was eavesdropping on the hijackers while they were in the United States, and they refused to give that information to the CIA. So at the very end, the hijackers were looking for a place to put their headquarters for 6 weeks before the attack. And the place they decided to put it was 2 miles from NSA headquarters in Laurel, Maryland. You could almost see that motel where they were staying from NSA headquarters. So the problem, like you said, is that you do all this collecting, what do you get out of it? And that's been sort of an argument a lot of people have made, is that they're collecting way too much. They don't have the capability to go through it, and it doesn't do you much good to find out that they were going to, do the Boston bombing 3 months after it took place. So they've got to be able to better target their information and narrow it down. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. He originally supported himself by the money he saved. He was making $120,000 a year. He was a single guy. He was able to collect a fair amount, so that probably got him through, I guess, at least the first year or whatever. Plus, he got money from, I think, he may make he'd do like a speaking engagement. He'll be on a big TV screen or a big video screen. I think he might have gotten some money from that. But the main thing right now, I think, is that he's there's a foundation. And I'm pretty sure this is it's happened after I left. But I think what happened is a foundation is giving him money to develop a. It's a Western foundation, not some Russian foundation. Giving money to have him develop ways for journalists to whistleblowers to contact journalists without leaving a metadata trail. So that a whistleblower might be able to contact me or the Washington Post or the New York Times or somebody else about something that's going on without worrying that the NSA is going to see that little trail. So that's what he's doing right now. So.
What is the psychology of these leaders who lie to Congress? Do they think they know better what's good for the country than the people know, or are they trying to cover up misdemeanors? Are they trying to hide their incompetence? What do you think it is that drives them to lie?
Yeah, again, that's a good question. What's interesting about it is that when they're lying to the Congressional Intelligence Committees who know they're lying because they know what the facts are. So when they're lying, they're actually lying to the American public who doesn't have the clearance to know what's really going on behind the scenes. So when Clapper lied about eavesdropping on millions of Americans, the senators sitting on the panel knew the truth. I mean, they knew it. They just couldn't say it. And Clapper had several choices. One of the choices was to say, I'm sorry, Senator, I can't discuss that here. I can discuss it in closed session. He could have said that. With Clapper, they sent him those questions a couple days in advance. This wasn't a surprise question. And then a day after the session, they sent him another option. They said, if you would like to change your testimony, you can do that. He never did. The whole idea here was that he and the same thing with General Alexander when he was denying the things I had in my article in Congress, before a Senate panel, or that was a House panel. Again, the whole idea here is to fool the American public into what was going on. They could have easily said, I can't answer that in open session. And then that would have been it. But they didn't. They wanted the lie to go out to the American public. So I think that's the answer to the question there. They want the American public to believe falsehoods. And that's why they did it. I know.
Yeah, he has suggested that he's for individual rights, or at least freedom of speech. That's why he did a lot of this. It's just suggestion. But why should we believe he's nothing other than a naive anarchist? Because he did something that, if he was believing in principles of individuals, freedom of speech, he would have went to a Western state with an extradition treaty, with no extradition treaty, so like Brazil, or a true neutral state like Switzerland. But he chose not to do that. He went to an infamous state known for violations of human rights, where he is now. So why should we believe he's nothing other than a naive anarchist?
Well, first of all, he didn't go to Moscow because he wanted to live in Moscow. He went to Moscow to change planes to go to Ecuador. He's in Moscow, as I said, because the U.S. cut his passport off after he left Hong Kong, but before he got to Moscow. So when he got to Moscow and they slide his passport through that little thing, a big red light goes on, means he can't go anywhere. He's stuck in the transit lounge. And the U.S. did everything it could to make sure he didn't go anywhere else. Matter of fact, they asked their allies to stop any plane flying out of Russia. They had a suspicion that he might be on, which ended up being that the president of Bolivia was on his presidential plane flying home from Moscow, and the French denied him overflight rights, and he had to make a emergency landing in Vienna, and the Austrian police went on and searched the plane. Could you imagine that happening to Air Force One? Somebody thinks he has a Chinese defector on board and it's forced down and they search the plane. It just would never happen. So they went to that extent to keep him there, so he's there not because he wants to be in Moscow, but because that's where he just happens to be. In terms of being an anarchist or whatever, I mean, he's the farthest thing from an anarchist. Anarchist doesn't want any government. He gave up an awful lot. He had nothing. He didn't get any money for this. Nobody paid him for this because he wanted the government to work right. He wanted the government to operate right. He didn't want the government not to operate at all. I've interviewed people. You know, I've been writing on NSA now for 32 years, so I've interviewed lots of people and lots of whistleblowers. So Snowden is the genuine article. He did it for altruistic reasons, and he had nothing to gain by it. He had everything to lose by it. I mean, he's facing life in prison. No, he's one of the rare people who will risk his risk his life basically for a principle, and I think that principle was very honorable, which was to expose things that shouldn't be going on. Just in the paper yesterday, there was a report that there's at least 3 or 4 different areas in government that are being reformed. Those things dealing with eavesdropping, none of those things would have happened. The president himself had a panel that came out with 46 recommendations on how to improve the system. None of those things would have happened if Snowden didn't come out. NSA does a lot of bad things. They do a lot of illegal things. They eavesdrop on people that is against the law, the warrantless eavesdropping operation. That was a criminal activity. There's no way around it. It was criminal. It was violation of a criminal statute. It's 5 years in jail. But the president didn't go to jail, the Secretary of Defense didn't go to jail, and the NSA director didn't go to jail. So again, I think he did this for altruistic reasons and not in any way to hurt the United States.
I'm just wondering what you think the percentage of Americans that think he is a hero as opposed to the people that think he's a villain.
Yeah, all these are really good questions. I didn't. Yeah, yeah. I have no idea. I do a number of speaking engagements, and depending on what part of the country you're at, it's interesting. You know, the funny thing was, it's not all what people expect. For example, I gave a talk at Texas A&M, very conservative school. Well, they actually picked my book, the Shadow Factory, for the one book that every freshman has to read coming in. And then they had me give a talk on Snowden and NSA at the George Bush Library. It doesn't just necessarily break along ideological lines, and I think conservatives who don't want the government on our backs, there's a lot of conservatives who are supporting the fact that we're uncovering these abuses by the NSA, and I think so I don't think it's hard to really say who's going to be supporting Snowden and who isn't.
Let's let people keep that information to themselves. Where's the next question?
You know, the Citizen for documentary was very powerful, and part of the power was that you saw this small, slight, seemingly vulnerable man who had, I was thinking, especially being an older person, given up his life because he was still a very young man. And so what is your sense of his fortitude, his moving forward with his life if it doesn't go the way he wants it to go?
Again, all these are great questions, and anybody that's much more interested in this topic than what we're talking about tonight should go see Citizen 4. That was a documentary produced by Laura Poitras about Snowden. It it's one slice of Snowden. It's from the moment they meet for about a week, pretty much. That's what it focuses on. Yeah, when I interviewed him, I was amazed at how articulate he was. First of all, when he first left the United States, when all this story broke, there were a lot of articles about how he only got through to the 10th grade or whatever. You know, he was a slacker and all that. Well, that was the good part about interviewing him on his early background and actually looking into it. I talked to his father twice. And you know, he dropped out of the 10th grade or he didn't drop out. He didn't finish the 10th grade because of mononucleosis. And then they put him to make up for it, they put him in a community college. So he was going there, and one of the people at the community college was actually a very expert person on computers, and he had his own little business. And he discovered that Snowden was very, very good at computers, so he hired Snowden. Ironically, this person worked out of his house, and his house was on Fort Meade, which is where NSA is. So NSA began working over there at his house, and that's why he never finished college, rather never finished high school, because he got the job and began working in computers. But when I was talking to him, you can tell the sincerity of his motivation, pretty much, when he's explaining to you why he's doing it, and he's talking about the Constitution and people have a right for this and people have a right for that. You can see it when you're watching the film Citizen 4. I mean, it's not phony. It's real. It's you know, like I said, I've been interviewing people for decades, and I can tell when there's somebody that's phony. It's all real. He's doing this for altruistic reasons to try to help the American public understand what the NSA has been doing. And I've been writing about it for a long time. I've found lots of abuses, and I've written about them. I've never had the fortitude to do whatever he did, but I've seen the abuses, and I've written about them. And he's one of the few whistleblowers, I think, that deserves a lot of admiration for what he did. Because, again, he got nothing out of it, and the American public's getting a lot out of it. They're understanding now what the government's been doing. And making changes that wouldn't happen if it wasn't for him.
Good time for one more, but let me just follow on that. Should he have run away? Was it kind of like OJ with the white Cherokee that, oh, he's running away from something? I mean, if he'd stayed here, I realized he would have probably been arrested, but wouldn't he have made his case more effectively?
Well, I don't know. I don't think that would have made his case more effectively. I think it would have made his case a lot less effectively because, you know, he wouldn't be getting these interviews, doing these interviews from Sing Sing or, you know, wherever he happens to be sent. So he's able to actually communicate his thoughts being in Moscow. I mean, it's up to, you know, you can go either way on should he have, you know, hung himself, you know, before he left and turned himself in or whatever. I don't think so. And, you know, one of the other people that I've gotten to know over the years is Daniel Ellsberg. Spent a fair amount of time with him. And, you know, he's the guy that released the Pentagon Papers way back and all that. And he's one of the biggest supporters for Snowden. Ellsberg actually turned himself in, but he says he didn't have any choice at the time. He had to. He was there was virtually nothing he could do. So he's fully in support of Snowden not doing the same thing he did. Again, it's a personal decision. If I was him, I would have done the same thing. But it does decrease his credibility in the eyes of some people.
Last question here. Thank you.
So what do you think of the very private and secret role of the NSA in providing our nation's defense and offensive in cyber, and their role in public for standards for the Institute of Technology and back to corporations that they find exploits that they're using?
Just if you could just say that once more.
So they provide, by mandate, the standards and technology for encryption,
Yeah.
but also at the same time have to exploit those.
Well, the Bureau of, well, they have a role in it. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So do you think there's
Right.
a conflict of
No,
interest
yeah, that's a
in
good
those two
question, right.
functions?
Yeah, no, it is a really good question because the people don't realize that, you know, when you look at NSA, it's sort of schizophrenic. Not sort of, it is schizophrenic because half of NSA, the whole mission of NSA is to protect the American public from hackers and so forth, from people that are trying to hack into the systems and so forth. The other half of NSA is creating these hackers that can break into the system. So you have one side of NSA that's trying to keep the American communication system secure, and the other half that's trying to break into it in different ways. So yeah, it's a sort of schizophrenic area. I always thought that would be an interesting area to explore at NSA. You know, talk to people on both sides and see what they think. But it comes down to there's one area that really is a hot point, and that's, as you mentioned, exploits and so forth. There's a thing that are called zero-day exploits. Probably a lot of people have never heard of that. A zero-day exploit means having a way to get into your computer through a system like Windows or something that nobody has found yet. So your protections, your Windows protections won't stop that. Well, NSA tries very hard, and they spend a lot of money paying people to find ways to break into those systems, and then they keep them. They actually talk about them like like an armory, where they keep them like weapons. The problem is when they find these little cracks in the system, they don't tell the companies about the cracks. And if they don't tell the companies that they have all these cracks they just found, it means somebody else can get into that system through one of those cracks. And that's become one of the big controversies now, actually way up to the White House, as to how much NSA should be spending time finding these cracks and not telling anybody, or finding these cracks and telling the company so that somebody won't get into your system. Anyway, it's a bit of a complex issue, but it's a really good one to discuss. So listen, thanks very much. These are all great questions. I wish all my audiences were this smart.